AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast, brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world, including this one, and all in one place. Available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts, a town built by a millionaire, a strike that paralyzed the nation, and a battle that redefined the relationship between labor, business, and government. This is the story of the Pullman Strike of 1894, one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations in American labor history. Here is the rest of that story.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
When George Pullman founded the Pullman Palace Car Company, he wasn't content just to bring elegant railroad cars. He wanted to build a way of life. In the early 1880s, just outside of Chicago, Pullman constructed an entire company town that bore his name, Pullman, Illinois. It wasn't just a factory complex either, it was a social experiment. The town had manicured lawns, paved streets, brick homes with running water, and a library, school, and church. It was clean, orderly, and tightly controlled. To many outsiders, it seemed utopian in a sense, a shining example of how industrial capitalism could also be humane. Pullman himself claimed that he wanted to give his workers a better environment and one free of the evils of city life. But beneath that beauty was control. The Pullman Company owned every home, every store, and every inch of the land. Workers paid rent directly to their employer. Company agents patrolled the streets and monitored behavior, and public meetings were discouraged. Alcohol sales were forbidden entirely. Even the flowers that decorated the porches were chosen by the company regulations. Pullman's workers were expected to live, work, and behave according to his vision, a vision of discipline and dependence. For years, it worked, actually. The company prospered, and workers kept quiet. But that harmony rested on one condition, that the economy would never fail. But then came the Panic of 1893, one of the worst financial crises in American history. Railroads collapsed, factories closed, and unemployment soared. Orders for Pullman luxury sleeping cars dried up. Seeking to cut costs, Pullman slashed his workers' wages by as much as 25%. But he didn't cut the rent. Every paycheck shrunk, but every rent bill stayed the same. To make matters worse, Pullman refused to open his books or even discuss the situation with his employees. Families went hungry. Workers pawned their belongings to pay rent to the same company that was underpaying them in the first place. One worker's wife later said, and I quote, "We ate stale bread and cracked wheat for weeks, while Mr. Pullman dined at his hotel." End quote. The hypocrisy was glaring. A man who claimed to be a benevolent employer now appeared to be just another Gilded Age capitalist. Polished on the outside, but pitiless on the inside. When a delegation of workers asked Pullman to reduce rent or restore wages, he dismissed them outright. So they turned to someone else. That someone was Eugene V. Debs, the charismatic leader of the American Railway Union, or the ARU, one of the first major industrial unions in the United States. Debs had organized thousands of railroad workers under one banner, believing that only solidarity across trades could balance the immense power of corporations. When Pullman workers voted to strike in May of 1894, Debs and the ARU saw a chance to test that very principle. They called for a nationwide boycott of Pullman cars, an unprecedented move. Railroad workers across the country refused to handle any train that carried a Pullman car. Within days, the strike spread from Chicago to St. Louis, Omaha, Denver, and beyond. At its peak, over 125,000 railroad workers joined. Train shipments froze. Passengers' trains halted. What began as a local protest had become a national crisis. The railroads, the arteries of the American economy, had suddenly stopped. The railroad companies responded with speed and ferocity. They hired strikebreakers and armed guards. They sought federal injunctions against the ARU, claiming that the boycott was illegal interference with interstate commerce. Business leaders painted the strike as a threat to civilization itself. One Chicago newspaper declared, "The reign of lawlessness must end, even if blood must flow." Behind closed doors, the railroad executives met with members of President Grover Cleveland's administration, urging him to intervene. Cleveland, a Democrat and self-described defender of order, soon did just that. He claimed the strike was obstructing the U.S. mail, a federal offense, and then dispatched 2,000 federal troops to Chicago. It was the first time in U.S. history that the federal government sent the Army to break a labor strike. The arrival of troops transformed an already tense standoff into a war zone. Workers, angered by what they saw as an invasion, flooded the rail yards. Crowds overturned train cars and then set them ablaze. Federal troops fired on demonstrators. Chicago's skies filled with smoke, and streets turned into battlegrounds. When the violence finally subsided, more than 30 people were dead, hundreds were injured, and millions of dollars in property was destroyed. The federal response crushed the strike, but it also exposed a chilling truth. The government, when forced to choose between capital and labor, had chosen capital. Debs was arrested for defying the federal injunction that prohibited ARU members from striking. He was charged with contempt of court and then sentenced to 6 months in prison. But prison would not silence him. It would actually radicalize him. While behind bars, Debs read the works of Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers. When he emerged, he was no longer just a union organizer. He was a political crusader. He would go on to start the Socialist Party of America and then run for president 5 times, advocating for public ownership of industry and the rights of working people. In his later speeches, Debs often reflected on the Pullman strike as a revelation, the moment that he realized that the power of corporations could not be challenged through strikes alone, but through systematic change. With the ARU broken and its leaders imprisoned, the railroads resumed operations under military protection. George Pullman, meanwhile, expressed no remorse. In testimony before a Senate committee, he insisted that he had acted in the best interests of his employees. The committee disagreed. Its final report described Pullman's company town as un-American, condemning his refusal to negotiate and his paternalism gone too far. But the damage was already done. The strike left deep scars, not only on Chicago but on the American labor movement. For years afterward, unions struggled under court injunctions and public suspicion. Many Americans came to associate strikes with chaos and violence. Yet amid the wreckage, there was only one symbolic victory. To erase tensions and recognize workers' contributions, President Cleveland and Congress declared Labor Day a national holiday in 1894, just 6 days after sending in troops to crush the strike. It was a small consolation, but obviously a lasting one. The Pullman Strike was not just a labor dispute, though. It was a moral and political reckoning. It revealed the contradictions of the Gilded Age, an era of immense innovation and inequality. On one side stood the captains of industry, men like Pullman, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, who preached efficiency and progress while accumulating vast personal wealth. On the other stood the millions of workers who built that wealth, enduring long hours, dangerous conditions, and wages barely sufficient to live on. Pullman, Illinois had been intended as proof that capitalism could be compassionate. Instead, it became the symbol of how power, when unchecked, corrodes even good intentions. The strike also redefined the relationship between labor and government. The use of federal troops to suppress the strike set a pretty bad precedent. Washington would intervene, but usually not on behalf of the workers. It wasn't until the New Deal era, 4 decades later, that federal law would finally recognize the right of workers to unionize and bargain collectively. But the seeds of that change were planted here, in the ashes of Pullman. Hopefully, today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about this subject. For answers to questions, sources for today's episode, to leave a comment, or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook, X, or Patreon. Stay curious, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.